Jack and the Beanstalk. In the days of King Alfred, there lived a poor woman in a cottage in a tiny country village. It lay hidden beyond the forests, many miles from London. She had been a widow for some years, and had an only child named Jack, whom she spoiled as best she could with what she had. Not wanting him to be saddened by the strains of life, she often turned a blind eye when he forgot to do his chores, or wandered off into the forest, leaving the chicken coop open. Because of this, Jack did not pay the least attention to anything his mother said, and was forgetful, careless, and a daydreamer. He didn't mean to be forgetful, and his mother didn't mean to let him wander off so often. But any mother knows that when there is work to be done and the strains of life are weighing you down, you want to keep the truth of it far away from your children for as long as possible. Over the years, Jack's mother had had to sell just about everything she owned and everything she could make, and beside the very little that she had was a cow. The poor woman one day met Jack with tears in her eyes. Her distress was great, and for the first time in her life she could not help reprimanding him, saying,
"Oh, you horrid child! By your great habits, you have at last brought me to utter poverty and ruin. I have not enough money to purchase even a bit of bread for another day. Nothing now remains to sell but my poor cow. I am so sorry to part with her. It grieves me sadly, but if we do not, we most certainly will starve."
For a few minutes Jack felt a degree of remorse, but it was soon over, and he began asking his mother to let him sell the cow at the next village, so much that she at last agreed. As he was going along, he met a butcher, who asked where he was off to with his cow. Jack replied,
"I'm off to the market to sell her."
The butcher pulled out some strange beans. They were of various colours, and Jack stared at them in wonder. This did not pass unnoticed by the butcher, who thought now was the time to take advantage of it.
"My boy, I would never offer these beans to anyone, as they have been in my family for years, a sacred treasure. But seeing you is so good a child and so much in need, I am willing to give you these in exchange for the cow."
This silly boy could not hide the pleasure he felt at what he supposed so great an offer. The bargain was struck instantly, and the cow was exchanged for a few sad little beans. Jack made the best of his way home, calling aloud to his mother before he reached home, thinking to surprise her.
"Mother! Mother! Look, I've done it!"
Jack's mother came running out of the house, thinking Jack had an entire sack of gold, but stopped pale in her tracks as she gazed at the handful of beans Jack held out to her.
"What is this, Jack?"
she asked, and then looked up and discovered that Jack no longer had the cow.
And where's our cow?"
"I've sold your cow, Mother. A kind butcher gave me these sacred beans, which he said he would never have done had I not been so good and kind looking."
"Oh, he did he? You foolish boy! Have you any idea what you've done? We have nothing, Jack, nothing. And with the one task you've been charged, you've signed our tombstones. How could you, you pathetic, stupid boy?"
His mother flung the beans and ran into the cottage crying, followed by Jack, who seemed more confused than sorry. That night, having nothing to eat, they both went supperless to bed. Jack woke early in the morning, and seeing something unusual from the window of his room, he ran out into the garden, where he soon discovered that some of the beans that his mother had thrown the day before had taken root and sprung up. The The stalks were immensely thick, and had intertwined so thoroughly that they were most certainly solid. Looking upward, he could not see the top. It appeared to be lost in the clouds. Jack clung onto the stalk and thought that, being sturdy as it seemed, he could climb up to the top and seek his fortune. He ran into the cottage to tell his mother, not doubting that she would be equally pleased with him and his brilliant idea.
"Have you not done enough, Jack?"
Mother, do you not see what is before us? Those sacred beans must certainly be magic and a true way for us to make our fortune."
"Fortune? It is a stalk that is inch further than you are able to see. How can you possibly know what fortune it may hold? Now, Jack, this is something you must swear not to do, ever."
Refusing to disappoint his mother again, Jack ran for the stalk and with a swift jump began pulling and stepping his way up. Ignoring his mother's screams, Jack continued until his arms and legs burned with pain, determined to at least attempt a positive outcome. After what seemed like hours, he reached the top of the beanstalk, quite exhausted. But, looking around, he found himself in a strange country, which appeared to be a desert, quite barren. Not a tree, shrub, house, or living creature to be seen. Here and there were scattered fragments of stone, and at unequal distances, small heaps of earth were loosely thrown together. Jack seated himself pensively upon a block of stone. He was completely disappointed and thought of his mother and how she had told him not to climb up, as she was convinced there was nothing worth climbing for. And now, as he stared around at the emptiness about him, he saw that she was right. Figuring himself to be dead anyway, considering the emptiness that lay before him, Jack walked on, hoping to see a house where he might beg something to eat and drink. He walked till after sunset, when, to his great joy, he saw a large mansion. This sight revived his drooping spirits. He doubled his speed and soon reached it. An enormously large woman in plain clothes was at the door, and Jack begged her to give him a morsel of bread and a night's lodging. She expressed the greatest surprise at seeing him, and said it was quite uncommon to see a human being near their house, for it was well known that her husband was a large and very powerful giant, and that he would never eat anything but human flesh, and would do anything to get it, which is why he was not at home, searching for his coveted feast. This greatly terrified Jack, but still he hoped to elude the giant, and therefore he again asked the woman to take him in for one night only, and hide him where she thought would be a safe place. The good woman was at last persuaded, for she was a compassionate and generous kind of woman, and took him into the house. First they entered a large hall, magnificently furnished. They then passed through several spacious rooms, all in the same style of grandeur, but they appeared to be quite empty and desolate. A long passageway was next. It was very dark, just light enough to show that, instead of a wall on one side, there was an iron grate, which parted off a dismal dungeon. From it came the groans of those poor victims whom the cruel giant reserved in confinement for his own appetite. Poor Jack was half dead with fear, and would have given the world to have been with his mother again, for he now began to fear that he would never see her again, and gave himself up for lost. He even mistrusted the good woman, and thought she had let him into the house for no other purpose than to lock him up among the unfortunate people in the dungeon. At the farther end of the passage there was a spacious kitchen, and a very excellent fire was burning in the hearth. The good woman told Jack to sit down, and gave him plenty to eat and drink. Jack, not seeing anything here to make him uncomfortable, soon forgot his fear, and was just beginning to enjoy himself when he heard a loud knocking at the door, which made the whole house shake. The giant's wife ran to secure him in the oven, and then went to let her husband in. Jack heard him ask in a voice like thunder, saying,
"Wife, I smell fresh meat."
"Oh, my dear, it is nothing but the people in the dungeon,"
replied she. The giant appeared to believe her, and walked into the very kitchen where poor Jack was hidden, and he shook and trembled, and was more terrified than he had ever been. At last the monstrous man seated himself quietly by the fireside, whilst his wife prepared supper. Jack calmed himself sufficiently to look at the giant through a small crevice. He was quite astonished to see what an amazing quantity he ate, and thought he would never have done eating and drinking. When supper was ended, the giant asked his wife to bring him his hen. A very beautiful hen was then brought and placed on the table before him. Jack's curiosity was very great to see what would happen. He observed that every time the giant said,
"Lay,"
the hen laid an egg of solid gold. The giant amused himself a long time with this hen, while his wife went off to bed. The giant fell asleep by the fireside, and snored like the roaring of a cannon. At daybreak, Jack, finding the giant still asleep, and not likely to awaken soon, crept softly out of his hiding-place, seized the hen, and ran off with her. He met with some difficulty in finding his way out of the house, but at last he reached the road with safety. He easily found the way to the beanstalk, and ascended it better and quicker than he expected. His mother was overjoyed to see him. He found her crying bitterly and lamenting his hard fate, for she concluded he had come to some shocking end through his endeavours. Jack was impatient to show her his hen and tell his mother how valuable it was.
"And now, mother,"
said Jack,
"I brought home that which will quickly make us rich. Now I hope to make you some amends for the hardships I've caused you through my laziness."
The hen produced as many golden eggs as they desired. They sold them, and in a little time earned many riches. For some months Jack and his mother lived very happily together, but he, being very desirous of travelling, longed to climb the beanstalk and pay the giant another visit in order to carry away more of his treasures. During the time that Jack was in the giant's mansion, whilst he lay hidden in the oven, he learned from the conversation that took place between the giant and his wife that he possessed some wonderful trinkets. Jack thought of his journey again and again. His mother begged him not to, and tried all in her power to dissuade him from climbing up the beanstalk once more. She told him that the giant's wife would certainly recognize him, and that the giant would desire nothing better than to capture him, and that he might be put to death. Jack, finding that all his arguments were useless, pretended to give up the point, though resolved to go. He had a disguise prepared, convinced it would work. A few mornings after this, he arose very early, changed his clothes, and climbed the beanstalk a second time. He was exhausted when he reached the top, and very hungry. Having rested some time on one of the stones, he continued his journey to the giant's mansion. He reached it late in the evening, and the woman was at the door as before. Jack addressed her, at the same time telling her a pitiful tale, and requesting that she would give him some food and drink, and also a night's lodging. She told him what he knew very well before about her husband being a powerful and cruel giant, and also that she had one night helped a poor, hungry, friendless boy who was half dead with travelling, and that the little ungrateful soul had stolen one of the giant's treasures. Ever since that, her husband had been worse than before, blaming her with his misfortune. Jack knew that the woman was talking about him during his first trip to her house. He did his best to persuade the good woman to help him, but found it very hard. At last she agreed, and as she led the way, Jack observed that everything was just as he had found it before. She took him into the kitchen, and after he had done eating and drinking, she hid him in an old closet. The giant returned at the usual time, and walked in so heavily that the house was shaken to its foundation. He seated himself by the fire, and soon after exclaimed,
"Wife, I smell fresh meat."
The wife replied it was the crows, who had brought a piece of raw meat and left it on top of the house. Whilst supper was preparing, the giant was very ill-tempered and impatient, frequently slamming his hand on the table for his wife to move faster. He was also still complaining about the loss of his wonderful hen. The giant, at last having ended his supper and eaten till he was quite satisfied, said to his wife,
"I must have something to amuse me, either my bags of money or my harp."
He commanded her to bring down his bags of gold and silver. Jack, as before, peeped out of his hiding place and watched as the giant's wife brought 2 bags into the room. They were very large. One was filled with silver coins and the other with gold. They were both placed before the giant, and he sat at the table counting his treasure. First, the bag which contained the silver was emptied and the contents placed upon the table. Jack viewed the glittering heaps with delight, and most heartily wished them for himself. The giant, little thinking he was watched, counted it many times, and then, having satisfied himself that all was safe, put it into the bag again and tied it up. The other bag was opened next, and the gold coins placed upon the table. If Jack was pleased at the sight of the silver, how much more delighted he felt when he saw such a heap of glittering gold. He even had the boldness to think of snatching both bags. When the giant had counted over the gold till he was tired, he tied it up, if possible, more securely than he had tied up the silver. He then fell back on his chair by the fireside and fell asleep. He snored so loud that Jack compared his noise to the roaring of the sea in a high-wind storm when the tide was coming in. At last, finally asleep, Jack crept out of his hiding-place and approached the giant, in order to carry off the 2 bags of money. But just as he laid his hand upon one of the bags, a little dog, whom he had not perceived before, started from under the giant's chair and barked at Jack most furiously. Jack was riveted to the spot. Instead of trying to escape, he could not move, expecting his enemy to wake any instant. Contrary, however, to his expectation, the giant continued in a sound sleep, and the dog grew weary of barking. Jack looked round, saw a large piece of meat, and this he threw to the dog, who instantly seized it, and took it into the closet. Finding himself delivered from a noisy and troublesome enemy, and seeing the giant did not awake, Jack boldly grabbed the bags, and, throwing them over his shoulders, ran out of the kitchen. He reached the street door safely. On his way to the top of the beanstalk, he found himself greatly weakened with the weight of the money bags, and really they were so heavy that he could scarcely carry them. Jack was overjoyed when he found himself near the beanstalk. He soon reached the bottom and immediately ran to find his mother. To his great surprise, the cottage was deserted. He ran from one room to another without being able to find anyone, and then ran into the village, hoping to see some of the neighbors who could inform him where he could find his mother. An old woman at last directed him to a neighboring house, where his mother was ill of a fever. Jack was greatly shocked on finding her apparently dying, knowing himself to be the cause. On being informed of our hero's safe return, his mother woke and gradually recovered. Jack presented her with his 2 valuable bags. They lived happily and comfortably, and the cottage was rebuilt and well furnished. For 3 years Jack spoke no more of the beanstalk, but he could not forget it, knowing it would make his mother unhappy. She would not mention the hated beanstalk in case it reminded him of taking another journey. Jack's mind dwelt continually upon the beanstalk and prevented him from being happy. He could think of nothing else. He tried in vain to distract himself. He would wake at the first dawn of day and stare at the beanstalk for hours. His mother saw that something sat heavily upon his mind and tried to discover the cause, but Jack knew too well what the consequence would be should she succeed. He did his utmost, therefore, to rid himself of his desire for another journey up the beanstalk. Completely overwhelmed by it, he began to make secret preparations for his journey, and on the longest day arose as soon as it was light, ascended the beanstalk, and reached the top with little trouble. He arrived at the giant's mansion in the evening, and found the giant's wife standing as usual at the door. Jack had disguised himself so completely that she did not appear to have the least recollection of him. However, when he pleaded hunger and poverty in order to gain admittance, he found it very difficult to persuade her. At last he succeeded, and was hidden in among the pots. When the giant returned, he said,
"I smell fresh meat."
But Jack felt quite composed. However, the giant stood up suddenly, and despite his wife's insistence, he searched all round the room. Whilst this was going on, Jack was exceedingly terrified and ready to die from fear, wishing himself at home 1,000 times, but when the giant approached the pots and put his hand upon the lid, Jack thought his death was certain. But the giant ended his search there, without moving the lid, and seated himself quietly by the fireside. Jack was afraid of moving or even breathing, lest he should be discovered. The giant at last ate a hearty supper. When he had finished, he commanded his wife to fetch down his harp. Jack peeped out and soon saw the most beautiful harp that could be imagined. It was placed by the giant on the table, who said,
"Play!"
and it instantly played all on its own without being touched. The music was uncommonly delightful. Jack was amazed and felt more anxious to get the harp into his possession than either of the former stolen treasures. The music soon lulled the giant into a sound sleep. Now, therefore, was the time to carry off the harp, as the giant appeared to be in a deep sleep. Jack seized the harp. The harp, however, was enchanted by a fairy, and called out loudly,
"Master! Master!"
The giant awoke, stood up, and tried to grab Jack, but he had drank so much that he could hardly stand. Poor Jack ran as fast as he could. In a little time the giant recovered enough to walk. Had he been sober, he might have overtaken Jack instantly. Jack was the first to reach the top of the beanstalk. The giant called after him in a voice like thunder.
Come back here!
The moment Jack got down the beanstalk, he called out for a hatchet,
Bring me a hatchet!
and one was brought to him. Jack looked upward as he felt the very roots of the beanstalk begin to shake with the weight of the giant who had begun his climb down. But Jack, with his hatchet, and the thought of what he could achieve if this worked as his motivation, hacked faster and faster, and cut the beanstalk right off itself. The giant, still screaming out threats upon Jack and promises of cruel punishments he would inflict on the boy, suddenly fell headlong into the garden to his death. Collapsing beside the decapitated plant. Jack's mother's face turned from terror to heated anxiety, and at last to delight when she saw the beanstalk destroyed. In the years that followed, Jack and his mother lived happily, and were both very generous with the riches they had found. Jack, never forgetting the efforts made for his wealth, continued to work hard to make the best of it without being lazy or squandering it. He tended his house, worked the land, but never again planted any beans.